Between 2005 and 2006, the quiet village of Nithari in Noida became the center of one of India's most disturbing crime stories. Children were disappearing, one after another, and families were begging authorities to take their cases seriously. For months, no one knew what was happening. Parents searched the streets, questioned neighbors, and waited outside police stations with photographs of their missing sons and daughters. But everything changed when human remains were discovered near a house in Nithari. Skulls, bones, and decomposed body parts began to appear in drains and shallow pits. Overnight, fear turned into national outrage. Rumors spread rapidly, accusations of organ trafficking, cannibalism, and a long-running chain of disappearances that had gone unnoticed. What started as a cluster of missing person reports exploded into a horror story that shocked the entire country. This is the story of the Nithari Killings, a case that exposed police failures, raised uncomfortable questions, and left families searching for answers that still feel incomplete. In 2005, Nithari was an ordinary urban village on the edge of Noida. Families lived close together, children played in the narrow lanes, and life followed a slow, familiar rhythm. But beneath the surface, something unsettling was beginning to take shape, something that no one yet understood. It started with whispers. A child went missing, and then another. Parents searched the streets, calling names into the night, hoping for an answer, a voice, or even a clue. When the children didn't return, families turned to the police. They brought photos, school notebooks, anything that could help identify their missing sons and daughters. But in those early days, the responses were cold and dismissive. Some officers suggested the children had run away. Others said they would probably come home. But inside the homes of Nithari, fear was growing. Parents stayed awake until dawn. Locks were checked twice. Children were escorted everywhere, even for the smallest errand. Families gathered in clusters, sharing the same stories: sudden disappearances, no witnesses, no trails. Nobody wanted to believe that something sinister was happening, but deep down, many sensed the truth. These children had not vanished by accident. As weeks turned into months, the cases increased. A pattern was forming, but no one in authority seemed to notice. The missing children came from poor households, daily wage families, and migrant workers. People who often lacked the influence or resources to pressure the system. Despite their grief, their voices were easy for the authorities to ignore. Nithari soon became a village living in shadows. Parents stopped allowing children to play outside. The small alleyways that once echoed with laughter became silent. Every unfamiliar face sparked suspicion. Every odd sound made people step out of their homes to check what it was. But the most painful part was the uncertainty. Families didn't have answers, not even false ones. All they had were questions. Where were the children? Who was taking them? And why was no one stopping it? The fear was real, but the silence was heavier. In Nithari, the community felt abandoned. They believed the police weren't listening, and worse, that no one cared enough to investigate what was happening to their children. By late 2006, the atmosphere had shifted completely. What began as a few disappearances had become a wave of terror. People were afraid to speak too loudly or accuse anyone directly. The unknown felt more dangerous than the truth. And just as the fear reached its peak, something happened that changed everything. A discovery so shocking that it broke the silence forever. But before that discovery, the disappearances continued, and parents were about to face the darkest moment of their lives. The first disappearance in Nithari didn't make headlines. It didn't spark a crowd or prompt a serious police response. It began quietly, with a family searching for their little girl, calling her name through the narrow lanes of the village. Her parents walked from house to house, asking neighbors if anyone had seen her. Most shook their heads. Some offered to help look. Others simply watched, worried that something was very wrong. But no one imagined that this was the beginning of a pattern. They believed she had wandered off and would return by evening. But she didn't. The next few days were painful. The family returned to the police station multiple times, asking officers to file a report. Each time, the answer was the same. She's probably playing somewhere. She will come home. You're overreacting. The parents left feeling helpless and alone. Weeks passed, and before the village could recover, another child disappeared, a young boy this time. His mother reported that he was last seen near a local market, buying snacks. She waited for him outside their home as the sun went down, her heartbeat growing heavier with every passing minute. When darkness came and he still hadn't returned, panic set in. Neighbors gathered, repeating the same cycle of searching, calling, hoping. But like the first child, he was gone without a trace. Then came a third disappearance, a fourth, and a fifth. Each new case chipped away at the village's sense of safety. Parents began to realize that the disappearances were not random. Something organized, something deliberate was happening. Children weren't simply wandering off. They were being taken. By mid-2005, the number of missing children had grown enough to spark concern among villagers, but still not enough to move the authorities into action. Many families were poor migrant workers, unfamiliar with police procedures. They had no influence, no political connection, and no way to force the police to see the growing pattern. Some officers suggested the children were being trafficked. Others assumed they were runaways. There were even whispers that the parents themselves were hiding something. Anything to avoid acknowledging the possibility of a larger crime. Parents began forming informal search groups. Every evening, they walked in groups of 10 or 15, holding torches, searching fields, empty buildings, and drainage areas. They knocked on doors of nearby houses, hoping for a clue, even a rumor. But every search ended the same way, with nothing. Fear soon turned into frustration. Families gathered outside police stations, holding photos of their children. Some shouted, some pleaded, some simply cried, their voices too tired to scream anymore. But the most heartbreaking part was the pattern. Each time a child went missing, the next disappearance wasn't far behind. Still, without physical evidence, the police treated each case as an isolated incident. They didn't connect the dots. They didn't see the danger. They didn't understand that the village was living beside a nightmare that would soon explode into national horror. By late 2006, more than a dozen children had vanished. Parents were terrified to let their children out of their sight. People began installing makeshift barricades around their homes. Mothers stopped sending their daughters to school alone. Fathers walked their children everywhere, even to the nearby shops. The village was changing. Trust was disappearing. And everyone had the same haunting question. Where are our children going? Who is taking them? Are they alive? No one knew that the truth was buried just a few meters away, hidden in drains, covered by debris, waiting to be discovered. That discovery would come soon. But first, the villagers had to confront the painful reality that the people meant to protect them were failing them. As investigations into the Nithari disappearances continued, one uncomfortable reality began to surface. Many of the early warning signs had been ignored. For months, families living around Nithari village had reported missing children. Many of these complaints were filed at the local police station, but almost every report was met with delays, dismissal, or outright neglect. Parents who desperately searched for their sons and daughters often received the same response. They probably ran away. This became a standard explanation given by officers, even when multiple children vanished from the same lane within months. One mother described going to the station almost daily, begging for help. Her daughter had gone missing on her way to buy vegetables. Each time she returned, the officers told her not to disturb them unless she had proof of a kidnapping. She left every day without answers and without progress. Meanwhile, more children disappeared. What stood out most during this period was the pattern. The missing individuals were mostly minors, mostly from working-class families, and mostly vanished within a tight radius around D5, the house later confirmed as the central crime location. But without proper investigation, the connection went unnoticed. Some parents even formed small local search groups. They searched wells, abandoned plots, even construction sites, any way a child could be left unseen. They pleaded with authorities to check specific locations. But according to multiple accounts, police either delayed inspections or never visited at all. The turning point came when a girl named Pyle went missing, an older teenager whose case drew slightly more attention because acquaintances claimed she had last been seen near the residence of Moninder Singh Pandha, the businessman living in D5. For the first time, the police took a more active interest. But even then, early investigations were slow. Witness statements were half-taken. Searches were not conducted thoroughly. Behind the scenes, frustration in the community grew. Parents accused officers of taking bribes to ignore cases. Others believed the police simply didn't care because the missing children came from poor households, migrants, and labor families. It was only after intense pressure, multiple protests, and constant confrontation that the authorities finally began to look more seriously at the growing list of disappearances. But by then, it was too late. The failure to act earlier would become one of the most heavily criticized aspects of the entire Nithari case. Had investigations started sooner, had warnings been taken seriously, had the initial disappearances been properly tracked, many of the children whose remains were later discovered might still have been alive. This chapter of negligence is now considered one of the darkest reflections of the case. It wasn't just the crime itself that shocked the nation. It was how long it was allowed to continue. The truth was there, for months, hidden in plain sight. But the people who were supposed to protect the most vulnerable failed to act. And the cost of that failure was irreversible. The morning of December 29, 2006, began like any other in Nithari village. Vendors set up their stalls, children played in the narrow lanes, and workers hurried to their jobs. But by noon, everything would change, forever. For months, families had complained that something was wrong around House D5. People whispered that strange things happened near the drain behind the property, a foul smell, unusual activity, and occasional sightings of suspicious behavior. Most of these warnings were dismissed. But on this particular day, the truth finally broke through the silence. It started with a simple instruction. Police officers were told to search the drain behind D5 after renewed pressure from local residents. At first, they expected nothing more than routine waste, discarded items, maybe animal remains. But as they began clearing debris, an officer noticed something partially buried in the mud. A small shape, pale, rounded at the edges. He bent down and brushed the dirt away. What emerged from the soil was unmistakable. A human skull. The discovery froze the entire team. Within minutes, officers signaled for backup. The news spread like wildfire, and families of missing children rushed toward the barricades, hoping and fearing what might surface next. As the search continued, more remains began to appear. First bones, then clothing fragments, then more skulls. The muddy drain behind D5 soon revealed the scale of what had been hiding there all along. One skull became two became five, and as police expanded the perimeter, digging deeper into the filthy, stagnant water, the count kept rising. Witnesses described the scene as a nightmare. Mothers fainted. Fathers shouted at the officers, demanding answers. Some stood silently, clutching photos of their missing children, too afraid to ask the question lingering in their minds. Is that my child? The police, now overwhelmed, cordoned off the area. What was initially treated as a routine check had rapidly turned into what would soon become one of India's most horrifying criminal discoveries. Inside House D5, officers began a parallel search. Rooms that once appeared normal, tidy, furnished, seemingly ordinary, now felt sinister under the weight of what had been found outside. Every drawer was opened. Every corner checked. The servants' quarters were inspected. The kitchen, the bathrooms, even the garden. Nothing was left untouched. It didn't take long before suspicion began to focus on two individuals. Moninder Singh Pandha, the wealthy businessman who lived in D5, and Surinder Kohli, his domestic helper. But at this early stage, the police still didn't know the full extent of what they were uncovering. By the end of the day, multiple sets of human remains had been recovered from a drain, enough to confirm that this was not an accident, not a one-time crime, but a pattern that had gone on for months, possibly years. This moment marked the official beginning of the Nithari murder investigation, a case that would expose not only a series of unimaginable crimes, but also deep systemic failures in policing, social protection, and community safety. The discovery of that first skull was the turning point. It shattered denial. It forced action. and it brought long-ignored fears into the harsh light of reality. From that moment forward, nothing about Nithari would ever be the same again. When the human remains were uncovered behind House D5, investigators knew they had moved beyond routine police work. What they faced now was a crime scene that demanded immediate answers. The first step was obvious: identify the people with access to the house, question them, and determine who might have been involved. Inside D5 lived two men whose lives could not have been more different. Moninder Singh Pandha, the wealthy businessman and owner of the house, spent much of his time traveling, and Surinder Kohli, his domestic helper, lived in the servant quarters and handled the day-to-day operations within the property. The police began by taking both men into custody. At the time, they had no detailed evidence linking either of them directly to the bones found outside. But the proximity to the crime scene, combined with the disturbing discoveries, left investigators with no choice. Kohli was the first to be interrogated. At the police station, officers described him as quiet, nervous, and visibly shaken. Hours passed as investigators tried to piece together his story. They asked him about the smell near the drain, the missing children, and the daily routines inside the house. Slowly, the questioning intensified. And then it happened. Kohli broke down. In a confession that shocked even the officers sitting in front of him, Kohli admitted to abducting children, killing them, and disposing of their remains in the drain behind D5. His explanation was chillingly simple and disturbingly calm. He claimed he acted alone, choosing victims who wandered near the house, luring them inside, and carrying out the crimes when no one was watching. The confession did not end there. According to investigators, Kohli described the events in disturbing detail, enough to leave even seasoned officers shaken. He spoke about how he disposed of the remains, how the bodies ended up in the drain, and how long this had been going on. As soon as word of the confession spread, the entire case exploded in the media. News channels rushed to Nithari. Crowds gathered outside the police station, shouting for justice. Families of the missing children tried desperately to get inside, hoping to hear the truth firsthand. But not everyone believed the confession. Some questioned whether Kohli had been pressured. Others wondered how such crimes could have continued for so long without anyone noticing. And many refused to accept that only one man was responsible, especially considering the rumors that had been circulating, rumors of organ trafficking, a larger network, or other people involved. Meanwhile, the police turned their attention to Pandha. As the owner of the house, he was now a central figure in public outrage. Investigators interrogated him about his relationship with Kohli, his knowledge of the disappearances, and his travel schedule during the years in question. Pandha insisted he was innocent. He claimed he had no idea what was happening inside his own home. He said he trusted Kohli, believed he was doing honest work, and never noticed anything suspicious. To some investigators, this seemed possible. To others, it was impossible to believe that so many crimes could occur without the homeowner being aware. As interrogations continued, forensic teams worked around the clock. More remains were recovered from a drain. Clothing pieces were matched to missing person reports. Families were brought in to identify what they could, a process that left many traumatized and unable to accept what they were seeing. Within days, the scale of the crimes became clearer. The Nithari case was no longer just a local investigation. It had become a national emergency. Public pressure mounted. The media demanded answers, and families demanded justice. With Kohli's confession on record and Pandha under arrest, the investigation entered a new phase. But even now, major questions remained unanswered. Was Kohli really acting alone? How long had this gone on? And why had authorities ignored warnings for so long? The next chapter in the Nithari investigation would attempt to uncover these answers and expose the cracks in the system that allowed the crimes to continue unchecked. As news of the arrests spread, Nithari transformed from a quiet neighborhood into the center of national attention. Families who had spent months searching for their missing children now stood face-to-face with a horrifying possibility. The truth had been right behind House D5 all along. Outside the property, a crowd formed and refused to disperse. Parents cried, shouted, and demanded answers from anyone in uniform. Many clutched photographs, pictures that had been carried to police stations, posted on walls, and shown to neighbors again and again. Now those same parents waited to hear whether their child's fate had been discovered in the drain. The emotional weight in the air was overwhelming. Some families collapsed upon seeing evidence recovered from the scene. Others remained silent, staring at the ground, unable to speak. And as grief spread through the community, something else took hold: anger. Residents began recounting the attempts they had made to alert authorities over the months and years before the discovery. They spoke of complaints ignored, reports dismissed, and warnings treated as inconveniences. Parents recalled being told their children had run away or that they were probably playing somewhere. Now, with the truth emerging in the most horrifying way, frustration turned into protest. Night after night, crowds gathered with placards, chanting for justice and accountability. What started as a local investigation was now forcing India to confront a larger, uncomfortable reality: how disappearances are handled, how vulnerable communities are protected, and how many warnings go unheard. But as the search for answers intensified, rumors began to spread. The nature of the crimes, the number of remains discovered, and the secrecy that had surrounded the house for so long created an atmosphere of uncertainty. Within hours, speculation began. Some believed the children were kidnapped for organ trafficking. Others claimed there was a larger network involved. A few even accused powerful figures of being protected from exposure. These theories spread quickly, fueled by fear and mistrust. The intensity of the rumors grew so strong that authorities had to publicly deny certain claims, insisting there was no evidence of organ sales or wider conspiracy. But many families were not convinced. They pointed to missing organs in some cases, or the number of victims, or inconsistencies in early police statements. To them, something about the story didn't add up. At the same time, activist groups, lawyers, and human rights organizations stepped in. They questioned whether the investigation had been handled properly. They raised concerns about forced confessions, ignored reports, and gaps in the timeline. They demanded transparency. Meanwhile, the media covered every angle of the case. News vans crowded the streets. Reporters interviewed grieving parents and frustrated residents. Panel shows debated police negligence, rising crime rates, and the failures of local governance. For the first time, the public outrage reached beyond Nithari. It became a national conversation. People questioned how so many children could disappear from a single area without triggering immediate action. They asked why the first signs of foul play, complaints of strange smells, unusual activity, and repeated disappearances had not sparked a thorough search earlier. They wondered whether the tragedy could have been prevented. The emotional pressure on investigators grew rapidly. Every statement was scrutinized, every action judged. Authorities knew they could no longer rely on standard procedure. They were now under the full glare of the nation. But amid all this public pressure, one group continued to suffer the most: the families. Many of them still didn't know which remains belonged to their children. Months of searching and hope had collapsed into a brutal reality they never imagined facing. This was the turning point in the Nithari case. Public outrage reshaped the investigation, forced accountability, and ensured the case would not be quietly buried. But it also revealed something deeper about the society around it: how easily the vulnerable can be overlooked, how quickly trust erodes, and how painful the search for truth can be. Once the initial shock of the discovery settled, the investigation moved rapidly into the legal phase. The arrests of Surinder Kohli and Moninder Singh Pandha set the stage for one of the most highly scrutinized criminal trials in India. What followed would divide public opinion, raise complex legal questions, and leave many wondering whether justice had truly been served. The trial began with a long list of charges. Both men faced accusations ranging from abduction and murder to destruction of evidence. The prosecution came prepared with forensic reports, witness testimonies, and Kohli's confession. They argued that the crimes were cold, deliberate, and repeated over a long period. Inside the courtroom, Kohli sat quietly. He rarely spoke, and when he did, his answers were short, almost mechanical. The prosecution claimed his confession was clear, detailed, and consistent with the evidence found at the scene. But the defense raised a critical question. Was the confession reliable? They argued that Coley's statements might have been made under pressure, and they pointed to inconsistencies in the early investigation to support their case. The attention then shifted to Pandha. As a wealthy businessman, he was portrayed by the prosecution as someone who either knew what was happening or chose to ignore it. They argued that crimes of this scale could not have occurred within his property without his awareness. But Pandha's defense insisted there was no direct evidence linking him to the acts. He traveled frequently, they said, and relied heavily on his domestic staff to manage the home. His lawyers maintained that he had no involvement and no knowledge of the crimes. While the trial continued, the public remained divided. Some believed both men were responsible. Others believed Coley acted alone, and some suspected that deeper truths remained hidden. The first verdict shocked the nation. Surinder Coley was found guilty and sentenced to death. The court described the crimes as brutal and unforgivable. But the biggest surprise came when Pandha was also convicted, despite weaker evidence directly tying him to the murders. Families of the victims reacted with mixed emotions. Some felt justice had finally been served. Others felt the truth was still incomplete, especially with so many unanswered questions. Over the following years, the case continued to evolve. Multiple appeals were filed. Some convictions were upheld, others were overturned. In several rounds of judicial review, courts ruled that Pandha had been wrongly convicted in certain cases due to insufficient evidence. These reversals intensified the controversy. Critics argued that the investigation had been rushed. They questioned the reliability of the methods used, the chain of evidence, and the possibility that early errors influenced the trial. Human rights groups also raised concerns about the use of capital punishment in a case with so many disputed details. Meanwhile, Coley's death sentence was repeatedly upheld. However, even his case sparked debate. Some legal experts argued that his confession lacked safeguards. Others believed the forensic evidence was strong enough on its own. Throughout this period, the families of the victims watched the legal battle with a mixture of frustration and exhaustion. For them, the courtroom debates did not erase the pain of losing their children or the years spent searching for answers. Each new judgment brought both hope and heartache. By the time the major verdicts were finalized, the Nithari Killings had become more than a criminal case. They had become a symbol of systemic failure, of ignored warnings, and of the deep vulnerabilities faced by marginalized communities. The trials revealed how complicated justice can be when evidence is scarce, investigations are flawed, and the truth remains tangled in layers of rumor, trauma, and unanswered questions. But one final chapter remained: the long-term impact of the case and what it revealed about missing children, policing, and society as a whole. When the courtrooms emptied and the final verdicts were delivered, Nithari was left with a silence that felt heavier than the chaos that came before. The case had ended on paper, but the impact was far from over. For the families, the investigators, and the entire nation, the scars ran deep. In the months following the trials, Nithari became a symbol of two things: unimaginable tragedy and the consequences of institutional failure. The families of the victims struggled to rebuild their lives. Some had lost their only child. Many lived with the knowledge that they would never have definitive answers about what happened or why. Annual vigils were held, photographs were framed, and memories became the only connection to the lives that were taken too soon. For them, the justice system felt both necessary and incomplete. Yes, there were arrests. Yes, there were convictions. But the pain did not end with the verdicts, and the questions that remained unresolved continued to haunt them. Meanwhile, the investigation exposed troubling issues in how missing children cases were handled. The Nithari Killings highlighted gaps that had existed for years: reports ignored, patterns overlooked, and vulnerabilities dismissed. As a result, the case pushed conversations that had long been avoided. Government agencies began reviewing procedures. Police departments were urged to take missing person reports more seriously, especially those involving children. Training programs were introduced to help officers identify early signs of serial offenses, trafficking, and abuse. National databases for missing children were updated, expanded, and connected across states to improve response times. Activist groups demanded accountability and long-term change. They called for stronger child protection laws, better supervision in low-income areas, and greater transparency in investigations. Some reforms were implemented. Others remained slow, caught in bureaucratic delays. But the impact of the case went beyond laws and procedures. The Nithari killings forced society to confront a truth that was easy to ignore: that the children of the poor, the marginalized, and the unnoticed are often the most vulnerable and the most overlooked. Years later, the lane behind House D5 no longer looks like a crime scene. The drain has been cleared. The house has been repainted. People walk past without stopping. But for those who lived through the tragedy, the memories remain vivid. The legacy of Nithari is not just about the crimes themselves. It's about the children whose lives were cut short. It's about the families who waited months for answers. It's about the failures that allowed those crimes to continue unchecked. And it's about the lesson that must never be forgotten: that every missing child deserves immediate attention, that every complaint matters, and that behind every disappearance is a family waiting for someone to listen. The Nithari case will forever stand as a reminder of what happens when warnings are ignored, when communities are left unprotected, and when justice arrives only after irreversible loss. It is a tragedy that reshaped policies, changed public awareness, and exposed the fragile line between safety and vulnerability. A story that ended the lives of many, but awakened an entire nation. As investigators continued digging through the drains behind House D5, something else began spreading just as quickly as the shock and grief: rumors. These whispers did not come from outsiders or distant observers. They came from inside Nithari itself. Parents who had searched for their children for months remembered the same strange pattern. Children disappeared. Police ignored them. And then suddenly, dozens of remains were found in one place. To many, it felt too big, too organized, too systematic to be dismissed as the acts of only two men. And so one question spread like wildfire: were these children taken for organ trafficking? The idea wasn't born out of imagination. It came from the reality of what the families had experienced: bodies with missing parts, bones mixed together, no clear autopsy explanations, no detailed reports shared with the families. Everything felt hidden, rushed, and incomplete. The authorities repeatedly denied the rumors. They insisted the killings were sexual, not commercial. But their denials didn't erase the doubts. If anything, the lack of transparency made the rumors grow louder. People wondered, why did it take years for the police to act? Why did the missing children's complaints sit untouched? And how could so many children vanish from the same lane without a bigger network being involved? Even years later, many locals say the same thing: we don't believe the whole truth was ever revealed. Whether the rumors were true or not, one thing became clear: the trust between the people and the system had already died long before the children were found. And after the discoveries, that trust was never rebuilt. The Nithari case did not just expose a crime. It exposed a system collapse. For years, parents had begged the police to search for their missing children. Some even brought photographs, eyewitness accounts, and names of suspects. But each time, the answer was the same: they probably ran away. They'll come back. But they didn't. And when the remains were finally discovered, people realized something even more disturbing. Many complaints were never registered. Some files were deliberately delayed. Others were marked with vague statements like "child missing, no further action." The system that was supposed to protect children had instead dismissed them. The turning point came when angry parents confronted the police publicly. Television cameras captured their grief, their anger, and their desperation. Suddenly, the whole country saw what had been happening in silence for 2 long years. And that's when the truth hit the nation. This wasn't just the failure of one officer. It wasn't the failure of one station. It was the failure of an entire structure that didn't believe the poor, didn't value their children, and didn't act until it was too late. Internal inquiries later revealed that officers ignored leads. Search operations were minimal, and the disappearances were treated as low priority. Even after arrests were made, the question remained: would the police have done anything at all if the media had not arrived? To many families, That answer was painfully clear. The police didn't fail them once. They failed them every single time a child went missing. And by the time the truth came to light, the damage was irreversible. The Nithari killings remain one of India's darkest chapters, a case where justice came too late for many families, and where the truth still feels fragmented. Dozens of parents continue to live with memories of children who never returned home. Their lives changed forever the moment their sons or daughters disappeared. The case forced India to confront the reality of missing children, institutional negligence, and the ease with which vulnerable communities can be overlooked. Even today, new questions continue to emerge. Were all victims identified? Were all crimes accounted for? And was every piece of the truth ever revealed? For the families of Nithari, closure is still a distant hope. What remains is a legacy of unimaginable loss, and a reminder that behind every unsolved disappearance is a story that demands to be heard.